doing these longer follow-ups, the necessity of doing the longer follow-ups over that transitional age period. So we can talk more about that.
Glad to.
Welcome, everybody. Just wait a couple of minutes as people are coming into our Zoom meeting here. Really great that you're all here. Welcome. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Glad you're here. Thank you for coming. We'll just wait just another one more minute before we get started with our presentation today. So thanks for coming, everybody. Hope your fall is beginning well and that you are all doing all right out there. Really delighted that you're all here. A few more people coming in. Okay, we'll get started. It's 12:02. That's the signal for me to start. I'm really delighted to be hosting a very special presentation today with Dr. Andy Finch. My name is Dr. John Kelly, and I'm the director of the Recovery Research Institute at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. And I am going to just share my screen with you to show you the slides. This is the next in our Recovery Science Series webinars, which is a SAMHSA-sponsored collaboration with the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry and the Opioid Response Network. So I'm going to play a little video right now, just a couple of minutes, just to give you an overview of the efforts of the Opioid Response Network, in which this is playing a big role. So let me just play this video real quick, and hopefully you'll be able to see.
Communities across the nation are mobilizing to address opioid and stimulant use and the overdose crisis. You can't overcome this alone, but we can, together, and we are. We are the Opioid Response Network, a coalition of 40 national organizations representing more than 2 million people. We serve all 50 states and 9 territories locally through our network of nearly 1,000 professionals working across prevention, treatment, and recovery. For state agencies, organizations big and small, and individuals working to address local needs, we bring training and education to bear on your efforts. We're here to help you help others through evidence-based support, all at no cost to you. For instance, the Opioid Response Network helped the Tribal College in New Mexico join forces with local organizations to develop a culturally appropriate prevention, treatment, and recovery training series for its students. In Rhode Island, we convened correction staff from 34 states to share how our program had reduced post-incarceration overdose deaths by more than 60% and supported them in their efforts to build similar programs in their home states. In West Virginia, we mobilized to help a clinic incorporate substance use disorder services into their practice, serving a faith-based community. We helped healthcare providers in South Dakota address barriers they face providing treatment services for their patients. We're here to help those on the front lines. So, what are your needs and how can we help? Visit the opioidresponsenetwork.org to learn more and to submit a request for support. The Opioid Response Network, funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Communities.
All right, time to put down your popcorn and pay attention. I hope that was audible. And you can see just what a great facility this is in terms of, people don't know, a lot of people don't know, so please spread the word that anybody can get consultation free and training free on any aspect of substance use disorder care, particularly around opioids and stimulants, but other things too, through that Opioid Response Network.org website. You just submit a request, and you can get expert consultation, expertise, and training through a number of different resources available through the network. So spread the word, avail yourself of it yourself if you'd like. Just in terms of our own, coming back to our own recovery science series here, this is today's webinar with Dr. Finch is part of a webinar series. You can see here we have these archived recordings from past webinars. Some of you I know attended those. We have up and coming ones on November the 16th and December the 7th. On November 16th, we've got Dr. Noel Vest, who will be talking about collegiate recovery programs, which actually Dr. Finch will touch upon a little bit today as well. And then Dr. Keith Humphreys from Stanford will be talking more broadly about addiction recovery science on December 7th. So put those in your diary. And which brings me to today. I'm really so thrilled that Dr. Andy Finch is here with us to talk about recovery high schools. Dr. Finch has been a leader, really the leader globally in this area of recovery supports for adolescents and emerging adults through this service of recovery high schools. Andy is a professor of the practice at Vanderbilt University's Peabody College. He's a core faculty member in the Human Development Counseling Program. He co-founded the Association of Recovery Schools and has been a lead researcher on 2 national studies of recovery high schools and helped write their standards for accreditation. So Dr. Finch helped start Community High School in Nashville, one of the early recovery high schools where he worked as a counselor administrator for 9 years. And Dr. Finch also helped found Vanderbilt's Collegiate Recovery Program. Dr. Finch's most recent project includes a recovery high school history, which will soon be published by Oxford University Press. Is that right, Andy?
That's correct.
Yep. And there's no one who's got greater expertise, experience, and authority to talk about this topic. So I'm really delighted. Andy has also been an inspiration to me in my own work. Andy's just been a great role model in his just as a professional researcher in recovery. And Andy, thank you for that. And over to you.
Thank you, John. And likewise, thank you so much for all the great work you are doing in the recovery field and really trying to get an evidence base built for a field that's really long needed it. So thank you. And I'm really honored to be asked to talk about recovery high schools today. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you do get a sense about recovery high schools as we move through the presentation. Maya, were you going to do some poll questions at the beginning before I share my screen?
Yes, we just have a few poll questions for the people in the audience today. There's 5 questions. I just launched it, so people should be able to see it on their screen. Make sure you scroll down. We have 5 questions in total, a couple just to get a sense of who's here with us today, and then 2 from Dr. Finch about recovery high schools.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's okay while people are answering. Is that going to be fine technically?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay, great. All right. All right, well, I want to thank everybody for attending today. And our topic is obviously recovery high schools. And before we get started, I guess just a couple of pieces. First of all, thoughts are with everyone who is in Florida. I'm guessing if you are in Florida, you may not be tuning in at this moment in time, but we have a few recovery high schools in Florida, and I know a large recovery community in that state, and really thinking of you all as the storm moves through Florida. And then of course on up the East Coast, we'll be thinking of everybody over the course of this week. Also want to recognize Dr. Paul Moberg. So much of what you will see today during the presentation is work that he helped start many years ago. Really did the first study of recovery high schools back in the mid 1990s, and I was fortunate enough to collaborate with Dr. Moberg on a couple of federal studies. And so, so many of the publications you see on recovery high schools and on collegiate recovery as well were authored or co-authored by Dr. Moberg. We lost Paul. He passed away last spring, and just have to recognize him. And actually on the slide, you'll see a picture of something called the Leaving Tree. In his first study of recovery high schools back in the mid 1990s, it was a school in Albuquerque, New Mexico called Recovery High School. And Recovery High School at that point in time, as many recovery high schools were, they were intended to be transitional places people would come for just a brief period of time. And as he would describe it, one of the most moving ceremonies at that school was graduation. And that is true at any of these recovery high schools. And students who successfully completed the program would dip their hands in paint and leave their imprint on this picture, which was called the Leaving Tree, that would hang in the school for future students to see. And he would often start his presentations or end his presentations with a picture of this. So I share this just in honor of Dr. Moberg, but also to show you the kinds of places that I'll be talking about today. These are places that leave a huge impact on the students who attend, but also an opportunity to really pass it on in the spirit of recovery. So I'm guessing nobody on this call needs to know, needs to be reminded of the impact substance use has on young people. But I pull up a couple of data points, and there's just so many ways to capture the impact of substance use on young people. The graphic on the left looks at substance use disorder among people 12 and older over a 5-year period. Now, of course, this is changing in the National Household Survey as they have transitioned to DSM-5. So some of this data looks differently kind of 2020 forward. But just as you look at it, you can see that the age bracket that we'll be talking about primarily today is 12 to 17-year-olds. And in this group, anywhere from about 4 to 5% have had a substance use disorder over that period of time. As we transition to DSM-5, I presume those numbers will probably double in size just because the catchment is a bit more. But I show you this to say two things. One, it's a fairly consistent number over time. And also, if you look at that 18 to 25 age group, that is consistently the largest population with a substance use disorder. And recovery high schools are schools that not only provide services for the 12 to 17, but also provide preventative services for that 18 to 25 group. And so the hope is that the benefits they get from a recovery high school will serve them as they move forward. And I urge you to tune into the webinar in November that Dr. Kelly mentioned with Noel Vest talking about collegiate recovery, because these two program modalities often work very closely together. You see on the right-hand side, among adolescents 12 to 17, about 172,000 had received treatment in 2019. That's another number that stays fairly consistent over time with small fluctuations. And then you look at that 18 to 25 group, once again, a much larger number of people. Now, what I would suggest to you is that recovery high schools serve not only people who have gone through treatment, probably 60, 70% of students have, but many of them haven't had access to treatment or have chosen not to go to treatment. So when we think about the population of students who would access a recovery high school, certainly that 172,000 teenagers who receive treatment in a year would be a group of students who would be a target group. But keep in mind, it's that larger group who have a substance use disorder who might not go to treatment that also might be in the market for a recovery high school. And whether or not they all would want to go, that's a pretty large number of students who would need services of a recovery high school if they wanted that service. So recovery high schools, as we talk about them, what are they? Well, they are high schools, and they are not treatment centers. And even though you aren't required to have treatment to attend, these are places that provide support services for people who want to stop using. And I'll talk more about the specific in just a moment. I'm showing pictures as I go through of scenes from recovery high schools, so you can see that they really are schools and they position themselves as schools. These are some lockers from a school in Portland, Oregon, Harmony Academy, one of our newer schools in the country. And you can see they typically have signage throughout the building, very supportive milieu. We are in this together. That is certainly a signal you would see in recovery high schools. Now, how did I find my way into this? Just briefly, I actually did help start a recovery high school back in the late 1990s, 1997. As John said, I was a part of that program for a while and served multiple roles at that school. And I thought I would just open with a poem about that school. This was actually one of the most innovative dissertations that I've ever seen done. It was a student here at Vanderbilt, before I was on the faculty here, who had come and interviewed 10 students at our recovery high school in Nashville. And she turned each of their stories into poems and then went back and processed the poems with them to see if they were accurate. And then she made that into her dissertation. And at the beginning, she wrote her own poem. And I'm going to have this, and this is recited for you, but you can read along with it. A poem about this school in Nashville, Tennessee, where I had worked.
The deep, deep tragedies that walk about this school, the victimized, the invisible, the raw and angry souls that have every right to be. I may be older in years, but their maturity is visible in their eyes that reflect years of suffering, well beyond their actual birth dates. And they tell me their stories, and sometimes it is almost too much to listen. I don't want to hear. I don't want it to be true. Somebody tell me how this could be. Why is the world so silent when there is all of this horror around us? And they even have gratitude. If I had not experienced that, they say, then I wouldn't be me today. And I am awed and amazed. I am deeply impressed when I hear them. I listen to them, and I am learning so much about not taking for granted, about honesty, and about the danger of lies, even the smallest, about facing myself and not pretending I am anything I am not. So much of their lives ahead of them, and yet every day is a struggle. To remember that escaping doesn't help. It may feel like it helps, or at least they won't feel anything, which is better than reality sometimes. And they have to remind each other that escaping leads to nowhere land, and they have all been there, and miraculously, they have all come back alive.
I want to thank my graduate student, Maggie Ratley, for reciting that poem. And I hope you can get a sense of the power of being in an environment like this day after day. And, for students that would stay often, a year or 2 years, you really get to know them well. It's a very rewarding job as a counselor, but you also get to see the long-term efforts of recovery that often are not seen so much in a treatment program. You get to see that continuing care piece of it. And it was such a supportive atmosphere, but some powerful stories in our schools. This is a picture of Peace Academy in Minneapolis, not far from the University of Minnesota. It's the longest operating recovery high school, opened in 1989. And you notice it's actually a church building. Schools over time have located in church buildings because they often have space available, school space available during the week that's not being used. And so it's often a good community partner. The next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about the 4 main criteria of a recovery high school. These are set in place by the Association of Recovery Schools, really to help give people some guidance about, are you a recovery high school? Are you not? And that's just important to help understand that this is a model of program that differs from, say, a school in a treatment center, or maybe a recovery program or substance use program in an alternative high school. There is a special category that we believe is recovery high schools. Within that category, you see a lot of variability, but you can certainly define the recovery high school. And the 4 main components of that is: 1, primary purpose is to educate students. Recovery high schools identify as schools. Their population is similar, but their purpose is an education, which makes B, pretty critical. They have to meet state requirements for awarding a secondary school diploma. Now, sometimes those diplomas are awarded by the local districts, but the courses that are being offered all carry value towards graduation. This is not just a tutoring, a remedial or remediation program. This is a program that's offering credits that count. The next two, and this is another school in Minnesota, didn't know that, there's that snow to help remind you of the great upper Midwest. At one point in time, there were 16 recovery high schools operating in the state of Minnesota. I think over time, they've had maybe over 20 schools that have operated up there, in part because of the policy environment that's been very supportive of recovery high schools over time. And it is the land of 10,000 treatment centers. So you'd have a pretty large population of kids that might want that. These other 2 points, one is the intent that all the students are enrolled are in recovery and working a program of recovery. And there's some variability in what that means, but these are schools that are set up for kids who are working on a recovery program, even though they honor many pathways to recovery. And then the final part is that any student in recovery who meets the district eligibility for that school can attend. Now that seems like it's getting down into the weeds a little bit, but the point here is to say, this isn't limited to say, only kids getting treatment from one program are eligible. This is supposed to be open to any student that would be wanting to come there, not just a specific program of a treatment center, which again, those programs do great work. They're just different from what the design of a recovery high school is. And also open to kids that might not have had treatment, but want to be working on recovery. To get a little bit more specific, we've actually created this in the Association of Recovery Schools over the last year to help schools kind of understand, are they or are they not? That these are places where youth enroll voluntarily. Recovery high schools really try to honor that piece that students want to be there, that they're not mandated or forced to be in the school. That doesn't mean that students don't often feel maybe a little bit of pressure to attend, considering what alternatives could be, but they try not to be mandated placements. They do promote abstinence. These are places where students want to be clean and sober. And certainly in an era right now where there can be difficulties getting treatment, this is something that schools are wrestling with. Where do we draw that line as far as allowing a student into the school? But really where most of the schools fall is they are really trying to be places where students are abstinent while they are there. And if not, they are actively working on a recovery plan to return to abstinence if they've had a recurrence of use. As I mentioned, different pathways to recovery. Oftentimes we see 12-step programs. Obviously, we know that's the most prevalent mutual aid program that is there, but recovery high schools are not exclusive to 12-step recovery, and in honor of the traditions, they're not affiliated either. But you will see many pathways to recovery honored in recovery high schools. As I mentioned, student leadership, student participation, peer leadership, these are all valuable components. Not treatment programs, not designed to provide primary treatment. If a student really does need more intensive treatment, that is a student that recovery high schools are trying to refer out for more intensive services. They don't tend to require prior treatment, although, like I said, 60 to 70% of students have had prior treatment, if not multiple treatment episodes. But with lack of access to treatment, recovery high schools are trying not to replicate the disparities of treatment. They are trying to be open to kids who want to be in recovery, but may not have been able to attend a treatment program. That being said, if they do require that, the recovery high schools are set up to make a referral. They're not replacing substance use treatment or replacing mental health treatment. Many of the kids, as you can imagine, as they get into recovery, their mental health issues really start to come to the surface even more. And so having clinical staff available to help kids as they start to show mental health symptoms, or again, making sure they're linked into community or counseling partners that can help with mental health needs. And again, this last point I think is really important. Some students may not benefit from a recovery high school. There's tens of thousands of young people around the country that would be eligible, but it may not be the best fit or the best environment for all. And so recovery high schools definitely have to realize that. Just a couple pieces about history to show how long these schools have been around. As John mentioned, I am working on a history book. I've been working on it for the last few years. It's been a very rewarding experience, very challenging to kind of find some of these pieces that are out there. Hopefully, it'll be done here in the next year or so in publication is my hope. But just to let you know how long these schools have been operating, the first school that really fits a lot of these criteria I've been talking about that we've been able to find is 1973 in Charleston, South Carolina, the Freedom Road School. It was a school that had a partnership with the Public Health Center, and the local school district mandated that all their kids that have substance use issues enroll in this school instead of other alternative schools if they have been removed from the school. And it was a really interesting program that Shirley Michael, who some of you may know her, she's been very involved on the national scene in addiction work and prevention work. She was a counselor at this program back in the early 1970s. In the mid 1970s, the PDAP program in Houston, which was an alternative peer group, still in existence, and it was the first alternative peer group, they actually started a GED high school where students would go, and John Cates was the teacher at this school. And they would go to school every day. They had a graduation ceremony. They were getting a GED because that was the only option for them, but it was a school and it was for kids in recovery in the mid 1970s. In Maryland, you can see on the right-hand side, these were probably the first full-fledged recovery high schools that we know of. When I say full-fledged, they were not affiliated with any treatment program, any public health center, any other program. These were run by the public school district in Montgomery County, Maryland, employed school district staff. They did work with the Department of Health in the school district, but they were a recovery high school that opened in 1979 in Silver Spring, and then a few years later opened a second campus in Gaithersburg. These schools lasted almost 30 years, and really, as I said, probably the first fully fledged recovery high schools that we are aware of. Two of the better known schools that came along, as I mentioned, all those schools in Minnesota over time. Sobriety High perhaps is the most impactful school that we've had of recovery high schools. You can see a feature in Life magazine. They were on national news broadcasts. My school in Nashville got started because they were aware of Sobriety High. And for many people, they thought this was the first recovery high school. Not true. It was the first in Minnesota, and maybe the most influential that we've had as far as launching additional schools and the recovery high school movement. They closed, unfortunately, in 2013 for various reasons, financial expansion, recession, a lot of those things, but they lasted quite a while. And then Pease Academy, which actually also started by people who were familiar with Sobriety High in 1989. I showed you a picture of that one earlier. They are still operating. They are in a charter network in Minneapolis, and they've been going strong since 1989, and it is the longest continually operating recovery high school in the nation. Some of the movement milestones, as I mentioned, PDAP becoming an APG in the early 1970s, all the way through a national association forming in 2002, the Association of Recovery Schools. Any of you interested in more information after this talk, I would direct you to the recoveryschools.org website for the Association of Recovery Schools. That's a movement that started almost 20 years ago this summer in Washington, when CSAP brought a number of us together. And there's a younger me at that conference many years ago. Actually, I'll go back there. You see the other circle, that's Paul Williams of Rainbow Connection fame. He was our keynote speaker at that very first ARS conference that helped launch the Association of Recovery Schools. Just an interesting little side note. But ARS is probably your best resource for information about recovery high schools. You can see the growth of recovery high schools over time. It's a pretty steady upward trend. Very few schools back in the late 70s, early 80s, as I said. And you can see right about in the middle of this graphic, when the Association of Recovery Schools started. And you can see a tremendous boom in schools, in part because of their advocacy, but ARS was also formed in part because there was a real awareness at the time of this need. Where you see a bit of a cratering, after 2010, a lot of financial difficulties during the recession led to a number of schools closing, including 4 campuses when Sobriety High closed in 2013. But good news is the recovery has also been swift. As of this year, we're back up to 45 schools. I understand a 46th is opening in Florida. And when that happens, it will be the most recovery high schools in operation at one time since recovery high schools began. And so the movement is strong, in part because we've started to really build an evidence-based. Average lifespan of a recovery high school, as you can see, is about 10 years. You can see some wide range on that. Schools that have opened a year or two, and then you have schools like Pease that are 30 plus years. So that's where your average comes in. This is a map of schools around the country. You could see some real clustering. Don't really have time today necessarily to go into all of the reasons why certain states have more. At the end of the day, though, very simply, those states tend to have financial structures, policy structures, open school enrollment policies that really make it a little more possible for a recovery high school to thrive. You can also see what I call recovery high school deserts. Outside of Texas and Florida, the Southeast, for the most part, doesn't have schools. My school in Nashville closed in 2008. Even out west, you see a lot fewer schools, some in the Northwest, Colorado, Wyoming. California has had schools over time, but they just have not been able to sustain them over time. They are very challenging schools to keep open for a number of reasons, but in part, dynamic financials, uncertain enrollment, and it costs a little bit more to educate a student in a school of this size, average size of about 30 students, than it would in a larger school. There are 7 accredited schools. The Association of Recovery Schools has created standards based on the research that we have and also best practices. And there aren't more, in part because this all started about 2014. We were kind of up and going with an accreditation procedure. COVID happened. It kind of got put on ice. So I think that's going to start back up again this year. But I always recommend to people, if you're wanting to check out a recovery high school and see what's going on, I tend to direct people to the accredited schools, in part because we know that they've gone through this process and they are using best practice standards. I thought I would just play another video to give you a sense of a school. This is an accredited school. This is Hope Academy in Indiana. They've been open since 2006, and this is a video that they have posted on their site. And I think just pay attention to what some of the people say about the school, as well as you'll see some images of scenes at the school.
Hope Academy is a recovery high school where students can earn their high school diploma, where students can learn and also get a lot of extra supports that they might not receive at a traditional high school.
It provides a sober, safe environment. It challenges them academically. It also challenges them mentally and emotionally, and it empowers the students to feel like they have the ability to conquer anything and plan for the future.
You don't come to Hope and immediately get better. But you come to Hope and you're offered a space that is safe and supportive to struggle. I think what's nice about here is we understand that that's a part of recovery.
You are not going to fail in our classes. We are going to do everything possible to help you feel successful and to achieve whatever that goal is for you and to get back on track.
I just love the collaboration, really, and the environment, and just the way in which recovery coaches, teachers, administration, counselors, how everybody comes together for what's best for the student. And I think that can be really rare in recovery spaces because sometimes treatment is so siloed, where here, there's bridges everywhere.
There's a difference between treatment and a recovery high school. We are recovery coaches, educators, administration, and so you're coming here to learn too, to get your high school diploma. We're just an extra added benefit to help support you in your recovery.
It's a place where you won't be judged, you will feel successful, you will grow. It's a place where the adults that are involved in the school, and not just the staff, but the board and our donors, believe in the pathway of recovery and believe that all students should have that access.
The surprise that students have, realizing the support of a community behind them that, oftentimes they thought, I'm a lost cause to my community. And when they realize that there's a number of people that don't see them as a lost cause, that just see them as someone who took a wrong turn.
There are gaps where students can't find their way to us. And so my goal is to make that pathway so that they don't have to figure it out. It's already there for them. And all they have to do is come, and we'll do the rest for them.
Like I said, I can't emphasize enough how rewarding it is to go to work at a place like that every day. That really does capture what a recovery high school is. And some things I hope you noticed in the video, one of the reasons I wanted to show it, they did a really nice job of showing classroom spaces. It looks like a school. You saw lockers. Not every school has lockers, but Hope does. You saw small class sizes, probably an average of 10 to 15, but you also saw the big group space. Recovery high schools tend to be of a size where you can bring the whole school or most of the school together for support groups, check-ins, activities, and that's really important for the community and the peer support. And they emphasize that they were a school. They have a school identity that's providing recovery supports. Oops. As far as funding models and how the schools are designed, you see of the 45 schools, the vast majority are receiving some amount of public funding. Maybe not complete public funding. Sometimes they're blending, a lot of times they're blending multiple sources of funding. But as you can see, about 33 of the 45 schools are receiving partial or full public funding, which is ideal for the student because that means typically those students aren't having to pay to attend the school. About 12 are fully private, which means they're going to have a tuition or fee structure built in, though even most of those try to raise money to scholarship so that it's not a full financial impact on the students who are attending. This is another picture of the outside of the school. A lot of the schools locate in industrial plazas, places where they can just find space. Some of the neat ones I visited over time, one was on the upper story of a pizza restaurant, which smelled really great at lunchtime. Another was an old converted saloon from the early 1920s. So wherever they can find space, recovery high schools will set up. Range of size, very small in the beginning, sometimes just a handful of students, on up to about 100 students. 115 was one of the largest that we've seen. That's not typical, though some try to enroll that many if they have the space and the teaching. Average size is about 30 students, though. That doesn't mean that you'll always have 30 students there at all point in times, but that's about the average size a school will have over the course of a school year. Therapeutic supports tend to be pretty eclectic, often heavily rooted in recovery coaching. But because of the mental health needs of the students, you tend to have LPCs, marriage and family therapists, social workers, along with alcohol and drug counselors. I think anybody thinking about a recovery high school needs to think either staffing or outsourcing to something beyond the alcohol and drug piece, because the co-occurring piece is very prevalent in recovery high school students. I mentioned alternative peer groups. One of the oldest schools was linked to an alternative peer group. This is a growing modality of support system that many recovery high schools have found beneficial to be linked to for after-school support on weekends, groups for kids to hang out with outside of school hours. A growing number of schools are finding linkages to APGs. They have been most prominent in Texas historically, but there is an association of alternative peer groups now. I think it's AAPG. And if you're interested in that, I direct you to them. John Cates is a director there now, and it really is a good support for students outside of school hours. Some of the evidence that we've had, we definitely need more studies and more work in this area, but we have had a couple of federally funded studies along with other smaller scale studies looking at recovery high schools. And I thought I would just show you a bit of data here just to see what we've learned about what works and how recovery high schools are working. This is another picture from Hope, by the way, kind of a circle up pretty prominent thing that you will see often at the beginning of a school day, or maybe the end of the school day before everybody heads home for the night in a recovery high school. Some of the acknowledgments of people who have worked, a lot of people that have worked on this over time. Some of these names might be familiar to you, but definitely thank you to NIDA for doing the big source of funding on two grants to study recovery high schools, one more descriptive and another more outcomes based. When we looked at the data of the students coming into recovery high schools in one of our studies, and this is pretty consistent on both of them, you can see that the breakdown in these studies has been a balance between boys and girls in the school, maybe tilt a little towards male, but again, pretty balanced. One thing that the schools have been working strongly on is to get more diversity in the schools. As you can see, about 78% white in this particular study, though there are other race and ethnicities represented, and some schools are definitely more represented by people of color than others. I think this is one of the reasons that making sure that treatment isn't a requirement for admission is there for students that haven't had access to prior treatment. This would be a way to hopefully diversify enrollment, and the Association of Recovery Schools has been very active in that effort. You can also see that the types of substances here, about 60% meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder, about 15% meet the criteria for opioid use disorder. Again, you're going to see larger numbers depending on the region of the country that you are in. Polysubstance use, though, is what's most typical of recovery high school students. And you notice 92% had a comorbid mental health condition and 88% had prior mental health treatment. I think that's really important when you realize the needs of the students that come into recovery high schools and the severity of what we're seeing. About 60% have had inpatient residential. In this particular study, 84% had outpatient either prior or were doing that on their own while enrolled at the recovery high school. And then mental health treatment, large numbers have had that, or 87% have had medication for a psychiatric disorder. And so again, you're seeing high levels of severity with the students that enter into recovery high schools. And so needing to really scaffold the mental health and substance use recovery is so critical. Meeting the criteria for all of these various disorders, 92% had met the criteria for any of these 9. You'd see the most common is depression, followed by anxiety. But you've got quite a bit on the list here. 31% met the criteria for PTSD, though a much higher number had experienced some level of trauma. As you can imagine, trauma is a very common thing to see in a recovery high school student. Hence, trauma-informed care is something that recovery high schools, I think, were out front on before a lot of other schools in the country. Trainings, people trained in DBT, setting up their environments to be trauma-informed is something recovery high schools have been doing for a long, long time. Some of the things that we found in the outcomes, that recovery high school students have higher graduation rates, lower absenteeism, more likely to abstain from substances, mean days of marijuana use, lower, greater declines in alcohol use, marijuana use, other drug use, really any drug use, you see it declines. And this is true both at the 6-month and the 12-month follow-ups that we have done in the recovery high school research. Also did a cost benefit analysis as part of this work. Again, Dr. Moberg and his colleague, Dr. Weimer at University of Wisconsin led this piece of things. And a couple of big findings from the cost benefit analysis for recovery high schools. One, they found, and they figured this out because they had to figure graduation rate to compute a cost benefit. And they discovered that students that had attended recovery high schools after treatment compared to those who did not had a 20 percentage point higher rate of graduation from high school, whether they graduated from the recovery high school or returned to a traditional school and graduated from there. It was 20 percentage points higher. That's a huge difference for a population of students who were coming out at baseline from a treatment program. The other thing to keep in mind is when you compare them on all these other pieces like prior drug use, mental health, the recovery high school students actually had higher severity on almost every metric than the kids who hadn't gone to a recovery high school. So again, to see that type of graduation rate is really impressive. And it was a net benefit of about $32,000. I will admit, cost benefit analyses aren't my area, so I can't really explain clearly how that's computed, but that was the finding from that particular component. 5 fewer absences over 90 days for recovery high school students. Absenteeism is still something that recovery high schools have to wrestle with students, even though it was a little bit stronger. And the predicted probability of high school dropout was only 10% for recovery high school, 27% for kids that didn't go to recovery high schools after treatment. So again, it's a pretty big difference when you look at the recovery high school students. Mental health findings I think are really interesting. Like I said, pretty high severity on mental health. And actually you see students who go to recovery high schools and students who don't, both improve actually after treatment. Recovery high school students probably a little bit more, but when you look at this particular slide, it's kind of complicated slide, but basically the crux of it is recovery high school students maybe do a little better compared to non-recovery high school students, but there's not a statistical difference. And if you look at it, at discharge are the open circles and squares. The filled in circles and squares are follow-up. And you can see that the closed or filled in ones are lower symptomology in both cases after follow-up, but not a statistical difference. I think a message for recovery high schools there is needing to continue focusing on the mental health piece and make that stronger, because that's so much of the issue that kids see in recovery high schools. A couple final slides, and I want to open it up in the last few minutes for a Q&A. Some of the cumulative observations from our data and from working in schools over all this time. I think certainly, as you can see, just on kind of a brief discussion of the data, is that clearly they provide an important function in that continuum of care. In particular, students with co-occurring disorders or high severity in SUD, which means there's a high need for services and support for this population of students. And the funding struggles that are very real, as I mentioned earlier, that means that schools need multi sources of funds. They have to braid funding. And so that's something that is a constant challenge. And certainly any federal funding or foundation funding that can become available will help schools continue to exist and to thrive. All the data we've seen suggests that the programs appear to be successful in supporting people in recovery and helping them transition either into another school or into college and afterwards. Very positive outcomes really across the board. Sample size is often one of the main reasons that we're not seeing some significance in the findings, but certainly some clinical significance in every finding that we saw. Academic outcomes, really around attendance and graduation rates. I think we still need to get better work around subject matter specific. We just don't have really good measures of those that have been that helpful. So we've got more to learn there. I've already mentioned about the mental health outcomes, similar reductions to students in non-recovery high schools. And then I think as far as recovery high schools, they have staff that are academic, therapeutic, really need to bolster the mental health staff in addition to AOD staff based on the needs. Family supports, recovery high schools do family groups and family supports, but that's probably something else that could probably be strengthened when we look at the needs of the students. And then any structural changes over time that can continue to reduce the gap between white students and non-white students and students of color to come into the schools. Last piece, there has been an impact with COVID. I think recovery high schools tried to stay open, definitely switched quickly to virtual, tried to have masking so that students could come on site, but we've seen kind of an enrollment piece that I think is still coming, lower enrollments across many of the schools, perhaps an impact of treatment access during COVID, and probably a number of reasons, but we still have to see the outcome of that. I think the big outcome is going to be the mental health crisis in the country is going to drive up the need for schools like this. And so that's coming. And so any enrollments that are smaller based on treatment provision, I think you're going to see quite a need. I think recovery high schools are going to have to figure out how to work through that increased need, maybe lack of access to treatment. How do we provide services to students, especially sometimes with smaller financial availability. So with that, I'd like to open it up in the last few minutes. Any questions that you all may have? Maya, should I stop sharing my screen? Would that be helpful at this point?
Sure, yeah, whatever's easiest for you. Yeah, we could stop sharing screen so we could see everybody.
Okay.
Thanks, Andy.
Great.
Yeah, I know we have some questions and lots of grateful comments in the chat, Andy. Thank you so much. That was really just a nice overview, really rich overview of the history and theory and the theoretical foundations and the empirical data on recovery high schools. Thank you, Andy, for that.
Thank you.
Really nice. Yeah, Maya, do we have some questions? I know I saw some there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question came that says, what explains the 10-year lifespan of high schools? This question came in when you were showing the graph of the high schools over time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I'd be curious from the questioner, does that seem like a long time or a short time? I think, we would like to think they would go on and on. Actually, that's a number that's been going up in part because we're seeing schools like Peace Academy that are now 30 plus years, schools in Massachusetts that have been around since 2006. And so schools, I think, are lasting longer. So that's actually bringing that number up. And I think what explains, the longevity of schools is there's a lot more support in place now at a national level, connections with networks of professionals that help to come up with ideas like fundraising, staff support, curriculum. So I do think that's really helping. I think the reason it's not 15 or 20 years, in part, we just didn't have a ton of schools 20 years ago. But also it is challenging to keep the doors open. It is a constant daily challenge funding wise and with uncertain enrollment. And so that's probably why it's not higher, but I actually look at that number and I think that's a positive.
Great. And another question that came in from an attendee is, how does a high school become designated as a recovery high school?
Yeah, so those 4 criteria that I laid out at the beginning, that's kind of the starting point. And we have people on the board of the Association of Recovery Schools that most of them have run a school or are running a school that have some familiarity with those criteria. And so if a school thinks it is or wants to become one, I think starting with talking with someone on the board, and we can kind of look at how your programming is set up and how it's designed. We've also recently created, just this summer, a logic model that I'm trying to make a little bit easier to use. I set it up in like a Google form, but it really is a series of questions that you can go through that says, if you say yes to this, it uses branch logic, then go to the next question. If you say no, go to the next question. And at the end, it basically says, it appears you are a recovery high school, or it appears you are not, and here is why. And so that actually is brand new. And so I think if anybody is interested in that or thinking about a school and wants to work through it, just let me know. We haven't rolled that out necessarily just to put a link out there, but I'd be glad to share that with people if you're wondering kind of how does that work for your school or a school you're thinking about.
Awesome, very cool. Okay, a few more questions. What percentage of attendees have experienced ACEs, and what types of ACEs?
Yeah, I think I don't have a good answer for you on the exact number. I've definitely seen some work. So I know that Mike Dennis has done some work in this area with adolescents in substance use treatment who have trauma, and it's a very high number, right? It's 80, 90%. My sense in working in this population is that it's right there. I mean, it's definitely on the top 80, 90% of students probably have. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is ACEs is an adverse childhood experience. The students in recovery high schools are children. They're as young as, early teenagers, 13 14 years old. And so if they've experienced trauma, it's trauma they've experienced in childhood. And so it's a very high number, but I think it's something that future work needs to focus in on. We haven't asked that specific question in some of the older studies, and probably should have, so that we could have a better answer for that. But certainly it's a high number.
Another question from Noel Vest asked, how can we put pressure on the national funding agencies to increase funding for research on the recovery phase of the continuum of care?
Yeah, thanks, Noel. Yeah, well, I think we're all in that together. I think we are trying to put on as much pressure as we can. I mean, I think we mention this at every national meeting that I attend. I think one of the main things I would say, though, on the national level, I do think it's important that people at the national level see the importance of programming for adolescents and transitional age youth in recovery. Prevention is certainly important, and these programs serve a preventative role. But I certainly think finding ways to make funding more available for schools like this. But I also think for research, I think we need to continue to find value in services research, especially for youth. And I think how do we put pressure? I think we need to have people that know the need in the rooms when those discussions are being had. I know the Association of Recovery Schools tries very hard, but it's a grassroots organization that's basically, it's all volunteers who, at this point in time, don't have a real presence, say, in Washington, D.C. And I think it's something as basic as that sometimes, that you're on the radar when those decisions are being made. And so I think things like this really, really help. And continuing to talk about that one of the biggest challenges, well, the biggest challenge, not one of them, the biggest challenge is financial. And often that is linked very directly to data and to evidence. People want to know, do the schools work before they're going to fund it? And thankfully, we have that data, but we need more of it. We need to have more robust data, and it needs to stay current. So yeah, I try to put that on every time I can, but I think we need a full out effort there.
Another question, what do some states do that help support the opening and longevity of recovery high schools? Also, I'm assuming that some schools are more successful than others. Do we know what components help to make particular schools more successful with students?
Yeah, so I think the main thing states do that make this more possible is there are many states that actually have in their legislation funding that goes to directly to recovery high schools and recognized recovery high schools. Massachusetts provides grants to 5 recovery high schools, and it started with 3 that comes from the state level. That's on top of per pupil funding. Minnesota does the same thing. And so to the extent that there is additional funding available from the state level on top of per pupil funding, that's probably the main thing a state can do from a funding perspective. I think the states that have a little bit more open enrollment, which is, kind of a controversial subject in education circles, but in the case of specialty schools like recovery high schools, the ability of a student to be able to go across district lines to a recovery high school and have transportation to make that happen really makes it more likely that a recovery high school is going to be able to maintain their enrollment. And I think that's something that is why a state like Texas, perhaps, or Minnesota has had a number of schools. Because if you're only going to have a handful of schools, you're going to have to make it so that kids can travel to get to that program and make it so they can actually go, money can go with them. So that's something that can really help. As far as longevity, I think that the schools that have lasted for a long period of time have stayed very linked in to the National Association. They have found multi sources of funding, braided funding, both at the state level, district level, and to some extent the national level. But I also think, being willing to try new things, keep your staff well. It's rewarding work, but it's hard work, and also continuing to market your program. You have to continue keeping your enrollment up and realize that the people that refer to you turn over a lot. And so you have to constantly market your program and let people know of the good work you're doing. And so those are just a few. I think there's other pieces, but I think those are some of the few ways and reasons that schools survive over a longer period.
Andy, thanks. We're out of time, but I just want to thank you again, Andy, so much for coming and doing this. It's a great talk today, and also for all the work you've done in this area over the last several decades, because without you, a lot of this wouldn't have gotten done. You've really championed the cause, and I'm very grateful to you for that. I know many people are, for all the work you've done, and Paul Moberg, may he rest in peace. I didn't realize he'd passed this year, so God bless him. He's been another champion as well, and sorry to see him go, but we'll do everything we can to support you, keep your foot on the gas. I know we're going to be talking in the future around these issues, but thank you, Andy, for all that you've done and for coming today and giving us such a great talk in this area. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next time, we hope. On November 16th, Dr. Noel Vest will be talking about kind of an extension of this theme in terms of developmentally anyway, in terms of collegiate recovery. So look forward to that. And Andy, thanks again. And thanks everybody for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.